So, most people have heard of the Titanic. Some have heard of the Edmund Fitzgerald. But what if I told you that there were shipwrecks that were far deadlier than either of these and had almost been erased from history? Some ships were overloaded with soldiers, some with families trying to escape a war, lifeboats stolen, chaos on deck, and in one case, an explosion that shattered windows over 60 miles away. And in some cases, not a single woman or child survived. These are the maritime disasters that nobody talks about. Each one of these disasters is more shocking than the last, and the last ship on our list today is the worst maritime disaster in history, and I bet you've never heard of it. So if you think these stories are unbelievable, just wait until you hear about the Morro Castle. So I did a different video on the Morro Castle. I'll link it below, but that was a luxury liner that burned at sea. Now, some people think it was an accident, but there's also strong evidence that it was perhaps arson by a psychopathic serial killer. So definitely check that one out. Let's get started with our list of 5 disasters worse than the Edmund Fitzgerald. On the morning of December 6, 1917, two ships slowly approached each other in the Halifax harbor in Nova Scotia. One was the Emo, and one was a ship called the Mont-Blanc. The collision itself wasn't dramatic, just metal scraping on metal. But what only the crew of the Mont-Blanc knew was that the Mont-Blanc was basically a floating bomb. Hidden inside of her hold were 6 million pounds of explosives. There were 62 tons of gun cotton, 250 tons of TNT, and 2,366 tons of picric acid. Add to that the barrels of benzol, which is highly flammable, that were added to the deck. When the hulls scraped together, the sparks ignited the benzol. The crew of the Mont Blanc knew what was going to happen and immediately abandoned ship. They started yelling to the other vessels to get away. They started trying to warn people on the shore, but no one listened to them because they were speaking French. Unfortunately, instead of running away, people ran towards the fire. There were tugboats in the harbor that went towards the fire to try and put it out. People on the shore started lining up on the shore to watch the fire, and people in their homes in Halifax started looking out the windows to see what was going on in the harbor. Then, at 9:04 a.m., the Mont Blanc exploded. It had so much force that it vaporized the other ships in the harbor. A 1,000-pound part of the anchor was found 4 miles inland. Windows shattered up to 60 miles away, and the shockwave was felt almost 200 miles away. It even created a mini tsunami there in the harbor. The official numbers were that the disaster killed 1,953 people, injured 9,000, and left 25,000 people homeless. Unfortunately, the true death toll was probably closer to 3,000 people. Because so many people were watching from their windows, over 360 people had eye injuries, and 41 were left permanently blinded. Until the invention of the atomic bomb, this was the largest man-made explosion in history. The SS Arctic was a luxury liner owned by the Collins Line. On September 27, 1854, it was sailing off the coast of Newfoundland through very dense fog and at full speed. It then hit another ship called the Vesta. At first, the passengers thought the damage was minor, but they quickly realized that the Vesta had pierced the hull of the Arctic below the waterline. They tried to patch it with anything, mattresses, sails, anything, but they quickly headed towards land. Unfortunately, so quickly that they ran over one of the Vesta's lifeboat, killing all but one of the 12 people on board. Pretty quickly, though, the water that was in the ship extinguished the steam engine fires, and the vessel was pretty much left dead in the water. There were 5 usable lifeboats left. It was enough for about 150 people, but that's far fewer than the 400 or so passengers and crew that were left on board. It pretty quickly turned to chaos and became one of the most infamous cases of cowardice in maritime history. Crew members and male passengers stormed the lifeboats and overpowered all of the women and children. Lifeboats that were meant for women and children were seized by the crew and sailed away half empty. One lifeboat was taken at gunpoint by the ship's engineers, stocked with food and water, and rowed away with 0 passengers on board. The captain did stay with the ship and tried to calm the chaos, but nobody was really listening to him. He did order everyone to start taking things like doors, decking, whatever they could, and lashing it together to create a raft. That worked a little bit, but not really. In the end, every woman and child on board died. There were about 88 people saved from that ship. 24 were passengers, and the rest were crew. The captain survived. Him and his young son had found the cover of a paddle wheel, and they were sitting on top of it. But when that sank and then quickly bobbed back up to the surface, the captain was hit in the head and left unconscious, and his young son died almost instantly, unfortunately. Meanwhile, the SS Vesta limped back to port and only lost the people that were killed in the lifeboat that the Arctic hit. This tragedy rocked the world and forever tarnished the name of the Collins Line and became known as the disaster where chivalry died at sea. On July 24th, 1915, Western Electric employees boarded the SS Eastland. They were on their way to a company picnic across Lake Michigan. Almost 2,500 people boarded the ship. Because of a recent safety law, the La Follette Seamen's Act, ships now had to carry lifeboats and life vests for 75% of passengers. But the Eastland was a shallow draft boat, already known for being unstable, and had to add these lifeboats and life vests to the top decks, which made it even more top heavy. As the passengers boarded, the Eastland started to list to port. Soon, still tied to the dock, it rolled over in the Chicago River. There was no time to launch any lifeboats, and it was a chilly, wet morning in Chicago that day, and a lot of the passengers had gone below to get out of the weather. Many passengers were stuck below decks, and some were even crushed by furniture as the ship rolled onto port side. 844 people died, including 22 entire families. After the tragedy, the ship was salvaged and sold to the Navy, becoming the USS Wilmette. It was used as a training vessel until it was finally scrapped after World War II. In April of 1865, the captain of the Sultana was desperate. The Civil War had ended, and business on the Mississippi River was collapsing. That's when he was approached by a Union quartermaster. The quartermaster told him that the government was paying per soldier per mile to take newly released Union prisoners back north. This quartermaster promised him at least 1,000 soldiers if he was paid a kickback. The only problem was the Sultana was only rated to carry 376 passengers. The captain agreed, and when the Sultana limped into Vicksburg days later, it was nursing an already damaged boiler. The crew patched it up quickly and poorly, and POWs from Andersonville and Cahaba were already starting to board the ship. Instead of 1,000 soldiers, nearly 2,000 showed up, and they put them all on the boat. The final count was about 2,137 people. At 2 a.m. on April 27, 1865, disaster struck when 3 of the boilers exploded. Some experts think that it's because the soldiers were so eager to see people and see settlements that every time they passed a settlement or another boat, all of the soldiers would go from one side of the boat to the other, which made the boat sway and created hot spots in the boilers. Many people were killed in the explosion, but those that weren't were thrown into the cold Mississippi River. And remember, many of these men had just survived the POW camps at Andersonville and Cahaba and were in no shape to be swimming in a frozen river. Of the 2,137 people aboard, only 963 survived. And why haven't you heard of this disaster? Maybe because it happened just days after President Lincoln was shot and ended up on the second page of many newspapers. But to this day, it remains one of the worst maritime disasters in American history. January 30th, 1945. World War II was collapsing in on Nazi Germany. The ship Wilhelm Gustloff had once been a luxury liner, a jewel of Hitler's Strength Through Joy program. It was once used as a hospital ship and even a floating barracks, but tonight it was part of Operation Hannibal. Operation Hannibal was the largest sea evacuation in history, and it involved taking German citizens out of East Prussia and trying to bring them back to Germany before the Soviet Union caught up with them. The Wilhelm Gustloff was designed to carry a couple thousand people, but on this night it was stuffed to the gills, possibly carrying as many as 10,000. These people were wounded German soldiers, nurses, refugee families, all of them trying to get back to the relative safety of Germany. Unfortunately, a Soviet submarine was waiting. At 9 p.m., Captain Alexander Marinesco fired 4 torpedoes at the Wilhelm Gustloff, and 3 of them hit. One slammed into the bow, another through the stern, and one right through the middle of the ship. The ship sunk completely in just over an hour, and anyone that wasn't killed in the initial blast was thrown into the freezing cold Baltic Sea. Only about 1,200 people were pulled out of the ocean, and the rest perished. That means that somewhere between 6,000 and 9,000 people lost their lives that night, and even the lower estimates make this about 4 times worse than the Titanic disaster. Unfortunately, the tragedy didn't end there. There were 2 other German refugee boats that were also hit by submarines. The Steuben and the Goya were also sunk and added thousands of casualties to that list. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff is still the worst maritime disaster in history, yet hardly anyone has ever heard of it. Most of these tragedies were forgotten. They were buried under wars or scandals or because the wrong people were on board. Everyone remembers the Titanic and the Edmund Fitzgerald, but almost no one talks about these 5 shipwrecks. But these stories deserve to be remembered. And remember, if you're interested in another maritime disaster, definitely check out my video on the Morro Castle. And if you don't want to miss any more important history stories, make sure you hit that subscribe button. I'll see you next time.